Before kings, before writing, before the first cities, people carved massive pillars on a hill in southeastern Anatolia. Then, over time, parts of the place were buried. The question is not whether the mystery is real. The question is what kind of people could build this before civilization looked the way we expect. There are places that change a timeline. Gobekli Tepe is one of them. On a limestone hill in southeastern Anatolia, not far from modern Sanliurfa, archaeologists uncovered massive stone pillars arranged in circular and oval spaces. Some of the pillars are shaped like tall T-forms. Some carry carved animals, snakes, foxes, birds, boars, and creatures that seem to move through the stone with a strange intensity. The date is the shock. The earliest monumental parts of Gobekli Tepe belong to the pre-pottery Neolithic, around the 10th and 9th millennia BCE. That means this place is older than Sumer, older than writing, older than the pyramids, older than the first cities, and older than the familiar world of kings and walls. This is why the site became famous. It seemed to reverse the order many people had in their heads. The old story was simple: first farming, then villages, then organized labor, then temples. Gobekli Tepe forced a harder question. What if gathering, ritual, and shared symbols helped create the social world that later made farming villages and cities possible? That is the real mystery. Not aliens, not a vanished empire with machines. A human mystery. How deep in time cooperation, belief, memory, and monument building already reached. Gobekli Tepe is often pulled into the wrong kind of mystery. Because it is old, monumental, and visually unforgettable, it attracts claims about lost advanced civilizations, hidden masters, or a forgotten world destroyed before history. Those claims are tempting, because they make the past feel like a secret being withheld. But the actual archaeology is already strange enough. The people who built Gobekli Tepe did not need to be a vanished technological empire to be extraordinary. They lived in a world before writing, before cities, before bronze, before kings, and before the state systems that later organized labor on a massive scale. That is exactly what makes the site important. If monumental building can happen before cities, then our timeline of civilization is not as simple as we thought. If people gathered to carve, move, raise, decorate, and transform these stones, then symbolic life and social coordination were already powerful. The evidence does not ask us to abandon archaeology. It asks us to take early people more seriously. That is the line this film should hold. Gobekli Tepe is not proof that history books are hiding a lost machine-age civilization. It is proof that human communities at the beginning of settled life were capable of a kind of shared project that still feels difficult to explain. The site was not always famous. For a long time, the hill did not announce itself as one of the most important archaeological places in the world. Stones visible on the surface were noticed, but their true age and importance were not immediately understood. The modern story changed when Klaus Schmidt and teams working in the region recognized that the hill held something far older and stranger than expected. Excavation revealed carved T-shaped pillars, enclosure-like spaces, and a scale of architecture that did not fit the easy picture of small, simple hunter-gatherer life. The stones were not random. They belonged to built spaces, shaped by people who understood quarrying, transport, placement, carving, and repeated use. The hill became a layered archive. It did not preserve one clean moment. It preserved phases, changes, reuse, and later fill. Some parts were monumental. Other parts were less dramatic, but just as important because they showed daily occupation and a more complicated site than the old popular image allowed. This is important for the story. Gobekli Tepe is not one frozen temple from one day in prehistory. It is a place that changed through time. The more archaeologists study it, the less it looks like a simple headline, and the more it looks like a living landscape of gathering, building, memory, and transformation. The power of Gobekli Tepe begins with its age. UNESCO places the monumental structures between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 BCE. That is an almost uncomfortable distance from the civilizations most viewers know. Sumerian cities rise thousands of years later. Egyptian pyramids rise thousands of years after that. The famous written records of kings, laws, myths, and tax accounts all belong to a later world. At Gobekli Tepe, there is no writing to explain the builders' names, no king list, no foundation inscription, no royal boast telling us who ordered the work. The stones speak without captions. That silence is part of the drama. We can date the site. We can map the buildings. We can compare tool marks, animal bones, architecture, sediments, and regional patterns. But we cannot simply read a line that says why the builders did it. That makes the date more than a number. It becomes a challenge to the imagination. If this place belongs to the early Neolithic, then complexity did not wait politely for cities. The urge to build meaningful spaces, gather communities, carve animals into stone, and return to a hill over generations was already there. Gobekli Tepe does not move civilization fully backward. It reveals that the roots were deeper, stranger, and more social than the old ladder allowed. The T-shaped pillars are the signature of Gobekli Tepe. Some are massive, rising several meters high. They stand in pairs at the center of enclosures, with other pillars set around them. The shape is simple at first glance, but the details complicate it. On some pillars, carved arms, hands, belts, and garment-like features suggest that the T-forms may be more than architecture. They may represent beings. But what kind of beings? Ancestors, spirits, powerful persons, mythic figures, social identities, something that does not fit our categories. This is where the episode should stay careful. It is easy to over-translate symbols from a world without writing. We should not pretend to know exactly what each pillar meant. But we can say that these stones were not neutral supports. They were shaped and placed in ways that carried meaning. The central pillars feel like presences. They turn architecture into encounter. A person entering one of these spaces was not just walking into a building. They were entering a world arranged around carved forms, animal reliefs, stone bodies, and shared attention. That may be one of the deepest clues. Gobekli Tepe was not only built to shelter people, it was built to focus them. The animals carved at Gobekli Tepe are unforgettable. Snakes slide across stone. Foxes stand alert. Birds, boars, scorpions, and other wild creatures appear with a force that can feel almost dreamlike. These are not decorations in the casual sense. They belong to a symbolic world where animals carried power, fear, identity, and memory. The important point is that this is a wild world. These images come from the threshold before full farming society dominates the landscape. The animals are not tame barnyard symbols. They are the creatures of a dangerous environment. Predators, scavengers, hunters, and beings that humans watched, feared, followed, and imagined. Vultures, foxes, snakes, and boars do not feel gentle. They feel charged. That makes the carved animals one of the best visual threads for the video. They let the audience feel that the builders lived in a world where human society and wildlife were not separated the way they later became. To carve an animal into a pillar is to give it a place in the human gathering. Maybe these animals marked stories. Maybe they marked groups. Maybe they marked death, danger, hunting, memory, or beings of another order. We do not need a single answer to feel the power of the question. Why did this world put wild animals in stone? One of the hardest things to explain is organization. The pillars had to be quarried, shaped, moved, raised, and arranged. The builders needed planning, food, skilled labor, knowledge of stone, and social reasons strong enough to bring people together. But this was not the world of pharaohs, royal officials, tax collectors, or written orders. That is why Gobekli Tepe matters so much. It shows that large, coordinated projects did not require a state in the later sense. People could gather for reasons that were social, ritual, seasonal, ancestral, competitive, or communal. Maybe work itself was part of the gathering. Imagine groups arriving from the surrounding landscape. Imagine stone dust, animal bones, fires, feasting, carving, memory, and stories told around half-finished pillars. Imagine not a workforce commanded by a king, but communities pulled by obligation, identity, and meaning. This is not romantic. It would have been hard labor. But hard labor becomes possible when people believe the work matters. The mystery is not only how they moved the stones. The deeper mystery is why enough people agreed that moving them was worth the effort. Before cities could command people, shared meaning may have gathered them. Archaeologists do not only study stones. They study bones, tools, sediments, plant remains, spaces, and patterns of use. At early Neolithic sites around this region, food, gathering, and ritual are deeply connected. That matters because monuments are not built by symbols alone. People need calories. They need social ties. They need occasions that make travel and labor meaningful. Feasting is one possible part of the story. A feast is not just eating. It can create alliances, settle tensions, display generosity, mark ritual time, and bind groups together. In a world before states, feasts can do political work without looking like politics. Gobekli Tepe may have been a place where communities gathered, worked, remembered, hunted, shared food, and entered spaces charged with carved beings. This gives us a way to understand the site, without flattening it into a single word like temple. Maybe ritual and social life were not separate. Maybe the sacred was also practical. Maybe a gathering place helped make larger human networks feel real. That is why the stones matter. They are not isolated sculptures. They are anchors for people. People who came together, worked together, ate together, and remembered together. The monument did not stand outside society. It helped make society visible. The phrase older than farming is powerful, but it needs care. Gobekli Tepe belongs to a region and a time when the relationship between people, plants, animals, settlement, and food was changing. Nearby landscapes are central to the story of early domestication and the Neolithic transition. This was not a clean switch from hunter-gatherer to farmer overnight. It was a long threshold. People experimented. They gathered wild cereals. They hunted. They settled in new ways. They returned to places. They changed their relationships with plants and animals. The familiar farming village did not appear all at once. Gobekli Tepe sits inside that transformation. That is why it can feel so disruptive. If ritual gathering and monument building were already important before full farming society, then maybe agriculture was not simply the cause of complexity. Maybe complexity, gathering, ritual, and new food practices pushed each other. The old question was, when people started farming, why did they build temples? Gobekli Tepe asks a sharper question. Could places of gathering and ritual help create the social pressure that made settled life and farming more important? The answer is not simple, but the question changes everything. The burial of Gobekli Tepe is one of its most dramatic features. Some monumental spaces were filled in over time with soil, stone, debris, and material from human activity. To a modern viewer, that can feel almost impossible. Why would people fill in a place that required so much work? This is where bad mystery becomes easy. Some people jump from burial to cover up. They imagine secrets hidden on purpose from later humans. But archaeology gives us better questions. Backfilling can be closure. It can be transformation. It can mark the end of a building's life. It can protect, bury, neutralize, renew, or make way for new phases of use. A place can be sacred and still be filled in. A monument can be important and still be ended. The fill itself is evidence. It tells us that the site had a biography. It was not built once and abandoned in one clean moment. It changed. People returned. They altered spaces. They buried things that previous generations had raised. That may be more mysterious than a conspiracy. It means Gobekli Tepe was not just a monument. It was a memory system. The act of burying may have been part of how the place stayed meaningful. Gobekli Tepe is often called the world's first temple. It is a powerful phrase. It is also too simple. The early interpretation emphasized monumental enclosures and the lack of obvious domestic life. That made the site seem like a special ritual center, separate from ordinary settlement. But recent research has complicated that picture. Archaeologists have identified evidence that makes Gobekli Tepe look less like an isolated temple on a hill, and more like a complex place with monumental, communal, and everyday dimensions. The site includes more than the famous circular enclosures. It belongs to a landscape of occupation, building, use, and change. This does not make the site less important. It makes it more human. If Gobekli Tepe was only a temple, we might separate ritual from life. If it was also part of a broader settlement and gathering landscape, then ritual, daily work, food, architecture, memory, and social identity were intertwined. That is often how ancient places work. Modern categories can be too clean. Sacred here, domestic there, political somewhere else. Early Neolithic life may not divide so neatly. So the video can use the temple hook, but the narration should open the door to the deeper truth. The word temple gets attention. The archaeology asks for more. Gobekli Tepe is now famous far beyond archaeology. That fame brings attention, but it also brings distortion. The site is often used as evidence for dramatic theories about a lost advanced civilization. The argument usually works by surprise. If ancient hunter-gatherers were not supposed to build this, then someone else must have. But that logic underestimates ancient people. It assumes that if early communities surprise us, the surprise must belong to outsiders, hidden masters, or a vanished elite. Archaeology gives a better lesson. The people of the early Neolithic were not simple background figures waiting for civilization to begin. They were already thinking symbolically, organizing socially, shaping landscapes, and building memory in stone. The mystery is real. The shortcut is the problem. A fake answer makes the past smaller because it takes achievement away from the people who actually lived there. The evidence-first story is stronger. It says we do not yet understand everything, but we have enough evidence to know this was a human project from a real archaeological world. No machines are needed, no aliens, no hidden global empire. Just people, stone, animals, food, belief, work, and time. That is more impressive than the conspiracy version. Gobekli Tepe should not be treated as a lonely miracle. It belongs to a wider world of early Neolithic sites in southeastern Anatolia and the surrounding region. Other places, such as Karahan Tepe and related Tepeler sites are helping archaeologists see that monumental building and symbolic landscapes were broader than one hill. That changes the question. If Gobekli Tepe was unique, it might look like an isolated anomaly. If it belongs to a wider regional pattern, then it becomes part of a major transformation in human life. People were not only surviving, they were creating places that gathered memory, identity, and power into architecture. This regional view is important because it keeps the story from becoming too narrow. Gobekli Tepe is the famous name, but the deeper subject is the world around it. Communities experimenting with settlement, ritual, animal symbolism, food, and social scale. The first great monument is rarely only about one monument. It points to a landscape, and that landscape suggests that the origins of civilization were not a single invention in one place. They were a long set of transformations, with different communities finding new ways to gather, remember, build, and belong. Gobekli Tepe is the door into that larger world. Gobekli Tepe changed the story. For a long time, many people imagined civilization as a ladder. First people farmed, then they settled, then they produced surplus, then rulers and priests appeared, then monuments and temples were built. That ladder is not completely wrong, but it is too neat. Gobekli Tepe shows that monumental symbolic construction can appear before the full city-state package. It shows that ritual and social gathering may have been drivers of complexity, not just results of it. This does not mean temples came before all farming and a simple global rule. It means the relationship between belief, food, settlement, and social organization was more tangled than the textbook version suggests. Humans do not become complex only when they get offices, kings, and rioting. They become complex when they share meanings strong enough to organize action. At Gobekli Tepe, those meanings were carved into stone. The pillars do not tell us their names. They do not give us a king. They do not give us a myth written in words. But they do give us a fact that cannot be ignored. Long before the first cities of Mesopotamia, people could already build a place that changed how later people imagined the beginning of civilization. The hidden tablet usually follows writing, clay, kings, gods, and texts. Gobekli Tepe takes us behind all of that. There are no tablets here explaining the ritual, no inscriptions naming the builders, no royal archive telling us how labor was counted. The story is older than that kind of memory. Instead, memory lives in stone. In pillars, reliefs, fill layers, bones, tools, floors, and the shape of spaces. The site forces us to listen to evidence that cannot speak in sentences. That makes it perfect for this channel. It is hidden history before history wrote itself down. It is a mystery that archaeology can approach but not fully translate. It has enough evidence to avoid fantasy and enough silence to remain haunting. The builders of Gobekli Tepe did not leave us a book. They left us a hill. And on that hill, they left a question about civilization itself. Did people build monuments because they had already become complex? Or did building monuments help make them complex? That question reaches beyond one site. It asks whether civilization began not only with grain, walls, and kings, but with shared stories powerful enough to move stone. After Gobekli Tepe, the story of civilization does not become simple. Farming spreads and changes, villages grow, ritual spaces shift. Animals and plants become domesticated in new ways. Over thousands of years, cities eventually rise in Mesopotamia. Writing appears in clay. Kings claim authority, and the world we recognize from Sumer begins to take shape. But Gobekli Tepe remains behind that later world, like a question carved in limestone. Before the city, there was gathering. Before writing, there was symbol. Before kings, there was organized labor. Before the temple became an institution inside a city, there were monumental spaces on a hill where people carved animals, raised pillars, shared food, and returned across generations. This is why the site matters. It does not give us a lost empire. It gives us something more difficult, proof that the roots of civilization were not only practical, they were emotional, symbolic, communal, and strange. People did not build the first monuments because they were modern. They built them because they were human. And that may be the oldest mystery of all.